Picture the most respected institution in Victorian Britain. Not the monarchy, not Parliament, not the Church of England, though all of those played their parts. Picture instead a company, a private trading company, incorporated by royal charter, that governed a subcontinent, commanded its own army of over 200,000 soldiers, collected its own taxes, ran its own courts, and answered, in practice, to no one except its shareholders. Now picture that same company, in the early decades of the 19th century, quietly running the largest drug trafficking operation the world had ever seen, sourcing the product in the poppy fields of Bengal, processing it in company-owned factories, smuggling it by the ton into a sovereign country that had explicitly banned it, and then, when that country tried to stop the trade and burned the product, sending a fleet of warships to shoot the country into compliance. That company was the British East India Company. The country it was dealing to was China, and the product was opium. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is not revisionist history. It is the single most well-documented drug trafficking operation in human history, conducted not by criminals hiding in shadows, but by the most powerful empire on earth, in broad daylight, defended in Parliament, celebrated in the press, and underwritten by the financial houses of London. There is a version of this story that most people have heard. 2 wars, somewhere in the 19th century, the Chinese lost. Hong Kong. Something about trade. And that version is true as far as it goes. But it does not go nearly far enough. Because what the Opium Wars actually were, at their core, was something that no respectable account wants to say plainly. They were a military campaign to protect and expand a drug market. The British Crown went to war, twice, to force a nation of 400 million people to stay addicted to a substance that was destroying them, because the money was too good to stop. Today, we are going to do what the polite version of this story never does. We are going to follow the money, sit in the boardrooms and the opium factories, read the letters between the men who lobbied for the wars, and ask the question that their contemporaries almost never asked, and that we should ask very loudly. How does the most powerful empire in the world, the empire that was simultaneously running a global campaign to end the slave trade, justify making its fortune by flooding a foreign country with narcotics? The answer is not comfortable, but it is important. And it begins, as so many British imperial stories do, with a ledger that would not balance. Let us start with the tea, because it is impossible to understand the opium without first understanding the tea. By the late 18th century, Britain had developed what can only be described as a national addiction of its own. Not to opium, not yet, but to tea. The British consumed it in staggering quantities. Workers drank it. Aristocrats drank it. Parliament debated policy over it. The Navy issued it as a ration. By 1800, the East India Company was importing roughly 23 million pounds of Chinese tea per year into Britain alone. And here was the problem. China was essentially the only place in the world that produced tea on a commercial scale. The Chinese knew it, and they had designed their entire foreign trade policy accordingly. Since the early 18th century, China had operated what was called the Canton system. European merchants were permitted to trade at exactly one port, Canton, now known as Guangzhou, and only during certain months of the year, and only through a licensed guild of Chinese merchants called the Kohong, and only under a dense thicket of regulations that left the Chinese authorities in complete control. The Chinese emperor was explicit about why. In 1793, the Qianlong emperor delivered a famous reply to King George III, who had sent a diplomatic mission to open broader trade relations. The emperor's response was a masterpiece of courteous condescension. "Our celestial empire," he wrote, "possesses all things in prolific abundance and lacks no product within its own borders. There was therefore no need to import the manufactures of outside barbarians." He was not wrong, at least not from his own perspective. China had porcelain, silk, and tea, the luxury goods that Europe was desperate to buy. Britain had woolen cloth, and the Chinese did not want woolen cloth. So there was one currency that China would accept for its goods: silver. Hard silver bullion, shipped across the world and handed over at the docks in Canton, and Britain was hemorrhaging it. In the 1760s, British merchants were sending roughly 500,000 pounds of silver a year to China to pay for tea and silk and porcelain. By the 1780s, that figure had nearly tripled. The East India Company's directors, sitting in Leadenhall Street in London, watching the silver drain out of their accounts, were experiencing the same cold terror that any business feels when it cannot stop losing money on a trade it cannot afford to walk away from. They needed to find something, anything, that Chinese buyers would purchase in return. They tried cotton. The Chinese market was indifferent. They tried tin and lead and watches and surveying instruments. Polite disinterest. They needed something that would sell itself. Something that, once sampled, would generate its own demand. Something that turned first-time customers into permanent ones. And they had it. They had been sitting on it for decades. In Bengal, the heartland of British India, the East India Company had inherited a thriving opium industry from the Mughal rulers they had displaced. The poppy fields of Bihar and the processing warehouses in Patna and Ghazipur produced a refined opium paste of exceptional quality. The company controlled every step. It licensed the poppy farmers, fixed the purchase price, operated the processing factories, and auctioned the finished product in Calcutta. The entire supply chain, from the field to the chest, was company property. There was just one complication. China had banned opium. The Yongjung Emperor had prohibited the drug in 1729. The ban had been extended and reinforced in 1799, when the Jiaqing Emperor issued an edict that was unambiguous. The importation and smoking of opium was illegal. The penalty for dealing it was strangulation. The East India Company acknowledged the ban in its official documents and then, in a maneuver of quite breathtaking cynicism, designed a way around it. The company would not smuggle opium into China directly. It would sell the drug at auction in Calcutta to private licensed traders, collect its silver from that sale, and then those private traders, operating their own fleet of fast, shallow draft ships called clippers, would carry the opium up the Chinese coast and deal it through networks of Chinese middlemen. The company would keep its hands clean on paper. The profits would flow back to company coffers nonetheless. It was money laundering dressed as arm's-length commerce, and it worked spectacularly. In the 1780s, roughly 1,000 chests of opium, each chest weighing about 140 pounds, were being smuggled into China per year. By 1800, that number had grown to 4,500 chests. By 1820, it was approaching 10,000. By 1838, the year before the First Opium War began, roughly 40,000 chests were entering China annually. That is approximately 2,800 tons of opium per year. The trade had reversed the entire direction of the silver flow. For the first time in over a century, silver was moving out of China and into British coffers, as Chinese merchants paid for their opium in bullion. China's treasury was draining. Its currency was destabilizing. Now, before we go any further, it is worth pausing on what this meant in human terms. Because it is easy to talk about chests and silver flows and trade deficits, and to lose sight of what 2,800 tons of opium a year actually does to the people consuming it. Opium addiction in 19th century China was not the quiet gentleman's habit that Victorian writers sometimes depicted back home. It was devastating. The drug produced tolerance rapidly, meaning users needed more and more to achieve the same effect. It produced a physical dependency so severe that withdrawal was medically dangerous. It destroyed the ability to work, to parent, to think clearly, to eat properly. Official accounts from Chinese provinces speak of entire villages where the adult male population had collapsed into addiction, government clerks who could no longer perform their duties, soldiers who could not hold their rifles, fathers who sold their children's food to pay for the next pipe. The East India Company's directors knew this. They had read the reports. It did not change the calculus because the calculus was very simple. Opium revenue from Bengal was funding the entire British colonial enterprise in India. By the 1820s, opium accounted for roughly 15 to 17% of all revenues collected by the East India Company across the subcontinent. Not 15% of trade profits. 15% of the total budget that paid for roads, courts, soldiers, administrators, and the ongoing project of governing 200 million people. Without the opium money, the entire financial architecture of British India wobbled. That is the heart of what the Opium Wars were actually about. not a philosophical disagreement over free trade principles, not a minor diplomatic incident involving a ship's flag. They were about protecting a revenue stream that the British Empire could not afford to lose. The immediate trigger for the First Opium War is one of the cleaner moments in this story, a moment of genuine moral clarity from the Chinese side that the British then proceeded to punish militarily. In 1838, the Daoguang Emperor had had enough. He appointed a senior official named Lin Zexu as imperial commissioner with a mandate that was absolute: eradicate the opium trade. Commissioner Lin was extraordinary. He wrote a letter to Queen Victoria that is one of the most remarkable documents of the 19th century. Addressing the Queen directly, he pointed out with meticulous politeness that opium was banned in Britain itself, that its cultivation and domestic consumption was a criminal offense in British law, and then asked a very simple question. We have heard heretofore that in your honorable nation, the people are not permitted to inhale the drug. If it is admittedly harmful, how can you seek profit by selling it to other countries, and even more, to China? He appealed to her conscience. He appealed to the same Christian moral framework that Britain liked to proclaim as the foundation of its civilization. He never received a reply. Instead, Lin moved ahead. He surrounded the Canton trading warehouses, placed the foreign merchants under a form of house arrest, and demanded the surrender of every chest of opium in their possession. Over the following weeks, 20,283 chests of opium were handed over. Lin then organized one of history's most dramatic acts of law enforcement. Over 23 days, the entire haul was mixed with water, salt, and lime, and dissolved into the sea at a beach near Canton. More than 1,200 tons of opium destroyed. Lin wrote a formal apology to the water spirits for the pollution. He was thorough. He was sincere. And he had just handed the most powerful empire in the world the pretext it had been waiting for. Here is where the story reveals the machinery behind it, because the First Opium War did not begin with a government decision made on principle. It began with a lobbying campaign by the men who were making the most money from the trade. The name at the center of it is William Jardine. Together with his partner James Matheson, Jardine ran the largest private opium trading firm in Asia, a house called Jardine Matheson that had grown immensely wealthy on the trade, and that survives, transformed but still recognizable, as a major conglomerate to this day. When Lin seized the opium and suspended the trade, Jardine did not wait. He boarded a ship for London, where he met personally with the Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston, and presented him with a detailed operational plan for a military campaign against China. Not a vague suggestion, an operational plan, complete with recommendations about which Chinese ports should be attacked, what naval force would be sufficient, and what treaty terms Britain should demand at the end of it. Palmerston implemented it almost to the letter. This was a merchant telling the British government to go to war, and the British government saying, "Yes, sir." Before we go further, we have to meet the man who might have stopped it, and understand why he could not. In the House of Commons, the case for war was passionately opposed by a young Tory backbencher named William Ewart Gladstone, who would later become one of Britain's greatest prime ministers. Gladstone stood in the chamber in April of 1840 and asked the House whether they were prepared to see the British flag hoisted to protect an infamous contraband trade. He said he was not aware of a war more unjust in its origin, or more calculated to cover this country with permanent disgrace. He asked whether a war to force opium on China could possibly be squared with the Christian principles that Britain publicly professed. The House shouted him down and voted for the war. The margin was 271 to 262. 9 votes. 9 votes in the British Parliament determined that the Empire would go to war to protect its right to sell drugs to China. The military campaign that followed was, from a purely military standpoint, a rout. China's forces were equipped and organized for a different era. British gunboats were steam-powered, iron-hulled, mounted with modern artillery, and capable of traveling upriver against the current. They were impervious to Chinese cannon fire. British forces captured ports almost at will. The Chinese fought with exceptional bravery in many engagements and were massacred for it. By 1842, the Qing government had no choice but to negotiate. The Treaty of Nanking, signed in August of 1842, was what historians call the first of the unequal treaties, and the name is precisely right. China ceded the island of Hong Kong to Britain in perpetuity. China opened 5 ports to British trade. China paid an indemnity of 21 million silver dollars, of which 6 million was specifically to compensate the merchants whose opium Zexu had legally destroyed. Read that again. Slowly. China was made to pay for the opium that its own government had seized under its own law. The country that had been on the receiving end of a drug smuggling operation was compelled to compensate the drug dealers. And, critically, the treaty said nothing explicit about opium itself. The trade was not legalized. It simply continued illegally, at a massively expanded scale, through the newly opened ports. The British had fought a war to expand a drug market and then declined to write the drug into the treaty, maintaining the polite fiction that all of this had been about free trade principles and diplomatic respect. 14 years passed. 14 years in which the opium trade expanded enormously, in which resentment toward foreign powers built steadily inside China, in which the Qing dynasty struggled with internal rebellions, partly fueled by the social devastation that mass addiction had produced. And then came the pretext for the Second War. On October 8, 1856, Chinese authorities in Canton boarded a ship called the Arrow and arrested 12 members of its crew on suspicion of piracy and smuggling. The Arrow had previously been registered as a British vessel, but its British registration had actually expired. It was, legally, no longer a British ship at all. The British consul at Canton declared that the Chinese had insulted the British flag. Even the British consul later acknowledged privately that the Chinese had probably been within their rights. But facts of that kind were not the point. Britain needed a lever. The Arrow gave them one. France joined the campaign on an equally thin pretext: the execution of a French missionary who had been operating illegally in China's interior. Together, Britain and France launched what history now calls the Second Opium War, though it was known at the time as the Arrow War, a name carefully chosen to obscure what it was actually for. The second campaign was conducted with a level of brutality that disturbed even some contemporary British observers. Guangzhou was captured. Treaty negotiations dragged. When Chinese forces fired on British and French envoys, the Allied armies marched on Beijing itself. What happened next is considered one of the great acts of imperial vandalism in human history. The British and French forces reached the outskirts of Beijing and found there the Yuanming Yuan, the old summer palace, the complex of gardens and pavilions that had been expanded by successive Qing emperors over 150 years into what was arguably the most beautiful collection of buildings on earth. Jesuit missionaries who had seen both Versailles and the Summer Palace wrote that the Summer Palace made Versailles look modest. The Allied commanders ordered it burned. It burned for 3 days. Soldiers who participated in the looting that preceded the burning described scenes of bewildering richness: jade carvings, porcelain collections, golden statues, libraries of irreplaceable manuscripts, scattered and then consumed by fire. Victor Hugo, writing from Paris, described it with searing directness. 2 robbers breaking into a museum, one loots it, one burns it, and they come home to Europe and laugh. The treaties that followed made the first set look mild. 10 additional ports were open. Foreign ships were permitted to navigate China's interior rivers. Indemnity payments were staggering. And critically, this time opium was explicitly legalized. After fighting 2 wars to protect a drug trade it publicly denied was the point, Britain had finally succeeded in forcing the legalization of its product. The drug became a taxed commodity inside China, which meant that the Qing government was now collecting duties on the thing that was destroying its own population. It was the final indignity. The victim was made a partner in the crime. There is a particular institution that deserves to be named here, because it is not a historical abstraction, but an entity that still exists, serving tens of millions of customers, with its headquarters today in London. In 1865, a group of merchants in Hong Kong and Shanghai established a bank specifically designed to finance trade across the region. Its founding capital came substantially from the profits of the opium era. The merchants who sat on its founding board were men whose fortunes had been built in the trade. The bank was called the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation. Today, it is known as HSBC, one of the largest banks in the world, with operations in 64 countries and a balance sheet in the trillions. The bank itself has acknowledged its origins in the commerce of that era. Historians who have examined those origins in detail are less careful about what that means. HSBC is not uniquely guilty. The entire financial architecture of British Hong Kong, the trading houses, the insurance companies, the legal firms, the docks themselves, were built on the proceeds of a drug trade enforced by warships. This was not a side effect. It was the design. The opium funded British India. British India funded the armies. The armies forced open the market. The market funded the banks. The banks funded the next generation of imperial expansion. It was a closed loop, a machine for converting addiction into empire, and it ran for the better part of a century. Now we have to reckon with a question that the Victorians largely did not ask. How did the most publicly moralistic empire in history, an empire that genuinely prided itself on bringing civilization and Christian values to the world, justify this to itself? The answer is that it used the language of free trade, and the answer worked. The 19th century British establishment had developed a near-religious faith in the principle that governments should not interfere with the natural flow of commerce between nations, that open trade brought prosperity and peace and human progress. This was the governing ideology of the age, and it was deployed with breathtaking cynicism to describe a drug smuggling operation enforced by naval cannon. When Palmerston defended the First War in Parliament, he did not talk about opium. He talked about British dignity, treaty rights, and the sacred principles of free commerce. The word opium appeared as infrequently as possible. Free trade was the costume. Addiction was the business model. There was also the deeply convenient fact that opium's moral status in early Victorian Britain was genuinely ambiguous in ways that are hard for us to imagine today. Laudanum, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, was freely available in British chemists' shops. It was given to fussy infants. It was prescribed for everything from toothache to anxiety to the pain of childbirth. Coleridge wrote Kubla Khan under its influence. Thomas de Quincey published a celebrated memoir of his addiction to considerable literary acclaim. The respectable middle class used it openly. The working class used it. It was not seen in Britain as something requiring the same moral alarm that the same empire's representatives professed when they found it being smoked in China. The hypocrisy was almost too large to see because it was everywhere at once. Britain was simultaneously running a global campaign against the slave trade, funding missionaries to bring the Christian gospel to the people of Africa and Asia, building schools and courts and railways in its colonies as evidence of its civilizing mission, and pumping hundreds of thousands of pounds of opium a year into a neighboring civilization. These things were happening at the same time, in the same empire, administered by many of the same men. And the cognitive dissonance appears, in the surviving documents, to have been almost total. There were exceptions. Gladstone never stopped believing the wars were a national disgrace. A handful of journalists and clergymen and members of Parliament called it plainly what it was. Their voices were recorded. And then the ship sailed anyway. By the end of the 19th century, China had begun producing its own domestic opium to supplement the imports, having learned, through a generation of forced dependency, how to cultivate the poppy on its own soil. The social damage was incalculable. Historians of the period describe a China that had been, at the beginning of the 19th century, roughly comparable to Britain in terms of total economic output, and that ended the century diminished, indebted, its government delegitimized, its silver exhausted, carved into spheres of foreign influence by half a dozen European powers and Japan. Its population bearing the full weight of an addiction crisis that a foreign empire had engineered for profit. The formal end of the opium trade into China did not come until 1917, when Britain finally agreed to halt exports as part of a broader Chinese suppression campaign. By then, the trade had run for approximately 120 years. The consequences did not end there. The unequal treaties became the defining wound of Chinese national consciousness. The opening of what Chinese historians call the Century of Humiliation, a period stretching from 1839 to 1949 during which China was subjected to foreign invasion, colonial exploitation, and territorial dismemberment. That wound has not healed. When modern Chinese leaders speak about sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the right to manage China's internal affairs without foreign interference, they are speaking from a national memory in which the last time a foreign power insisted loudly on its rights. Inside China, it was insisting on the right to sell drugs. The territorial questions that generate friction today, Hong Kong's history, Taiwan, the South China Sea, carry within them, in ways both direct and indirect, the long echo of what was settled at gunpoint in 1842 and 1860. So, here is where the evidence leaves us, and it is worth being precise, because precision matters here more than usual. Was the East India Company a drug cartel? Functionally, yes. It sourced a narcotic substance, controlled its production, managed its distribution network, used financial intermediaries to maintain legal distance from the smuggling operation, and when the market was threatened, it used armed force to protect the business. That is the operational definition of what a drug cartel does. The scale was simply larger than anything a modern cartel has ever achieved. Did the British government go to war, twice, to protect a drug trade? Yes. The documentary record is explicit. The lobbying of William Jardine, the parliamentary debates, the treaty terms, the indemnity payments that specifically compensated opium merchants for their destroyed product leave no room for a more flattering interpretation. Was this an aberration? A rare lapse in an otherwise principled enterprise? No. It was the financial engine of the whole operation. The opium revenue funded British India. British India funded the military capacity that projected British power across Asia and Africa. Every school and railway and court the British built in the subcontinent was built on a foundation that included this. This is not an argument that Britain built nothing, that the full history of the empire was only darkness, or that complexity does not exist. History is never only one thing. But it is an argument that the comfortable version, the version in which the opium trade is a minor footnote and the wars are a distant chapter about diplomatic misunderstanding, is a lie of omission, and a significant one. The men who lobbied for these wars, who profited from them, who defended them in Parliament with the language of civilization and free commerce, understood exactly what they were doing. Their letters survive. Their account books survive. Their parliamentary speeches survive. They were not confused about the nature of the business. They were interested in its continuation. And the consequences of that interest, the geopolitics of a region home to billions of people, are still, in the 21st century, still being worked out. The map of modern Asia was not drawn by accident or by the invisible hand of free markets. Significant portions of it were drawn by men who needed to protect a drug revenue stream, and had the warships to insist on it. That, in the end, is a far more important truth than anything a conspiracy theory has ever offered. Because it happened in the open, it was defended publicly. And it worked. If you stayed until the very end of this one, leave a poppy in the comments so I know who was here for the full story. If you want history told straight, the comfortable version stripped away and the evidence laid out without flinching, then subscribe, because that is exactly what we do here, every single week. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.